morning, church.
Good morning.
Let me just start off by giving honor to God, honor to my wife and Pastor Tate and Mother Tate, and to all the officers of Rosehill Missionary Baptist Church. I greet you with Christ's joy.
Amen.
Our Sunday school lesson this morning is titled Justice and Kindness. Justice and Kindness. I also want to acknowledge all the officers of Rosehill in all their respected places. The title is Justice and Kindness. Devotional reading is coming out of 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1 through 7, 9 through 12. Background scripture is 2 Samuel chapter 9. Lesson aims. After participating in this lesson, each listener will be able to, number one, summarize the history behind David's kindness to Mephibosheth. Number two, evaluate David's motives in doing so. Number three, make a commitment to show kindness to a marginalized person in the week ahead. Lesson outlines. Introduction. A, kindness from memory. B, lesson content. A, promise remembered, 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1 through 4. David's search. B, Ziba's knowledge. A, promise fulfilled, 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 5 through 7 and 9 through 12. A, Mephibosheth's arrival. B, David's declaration. C, the new normal. Healing through helping. Conclusion. A, kindness from experience. B, prayer. C, thoughts to remember. All right, and our foundational scripture for this morning is coming out of 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1 through 7, 9 through 12, and it reads, And David said, Is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there was of the house of Saul a servant whose name was Ziba. And when they had called him unto David, the king said unto him, Art thou Ziba? And he said, Thy servant is he. Yes. And the king said, Is there not yet any of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God unto him? And Ziba said unto the king, Jonathan has yet a son, which is lame in his feet. And the king said to him, Where is he? And Ziba said unto the king, Behold, he is in the house of Machir, and I'm the son of Amiel in Lodabar. Then King David sent and fetched him out of the house of Machir, and the son of Amiel from Lodabar. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was to come unto David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, Behold, thy servant. And David said unto him, Fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continuously. Then the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said unto him, I have given unto thee master's son all that pertains to Saul and to all his house. Thus, therefore, thy son and thy servant shall till the land for him, and thou shalt bring in the fruits, that thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread always at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said unto the king, according to all that my lord the king has commanded his servants, so shall thy servants do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table as one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all that dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants unto Mephibosheth. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and doing of his word. 2 Samuel is a hidden gem.
Yes, it is.
In this lesson. But before we get into the lesson, I kind of want to bring us up to speed about how we get to this point. Saul is the people's king. He was birthed out of the people's will. They wanted to be like the other nations, and so Saul is now the king of Israel, and Saul is in this heated battle with the Philistines, and Jonathan and his brothers and Saul, Jonathan is killed in this battle, and all Saul's sons are killed in this battle, and Saul is wounded by one of the archers, and they retreat, and he tells his armor bearer that I want you to kill me, don't let me fall into hands of these Philistines. And the armor bearer feared taking Saul's life, so he's like, no, I can't do that. And I'm paraphrasing, I'm putting these in my own words. And he said, I can't kill you like that. And so Saul said, okay, well, Saul fell on his own sword. And the armor bearer noticed that Saul was dead. And he did likewise and fell on his own sword. And so the news about Saul spread. And one of the things about David was the people loved David, and David, he finished the military campaign that Joshua started when they came into the promised land. And so David dealt with the Philistines severely. He dealt with all of the other surrounding nations in that area, and he defeated all of them. And so the people elected David to be king. David had dealt with all of their enemies, and so now David is king. And this is where we get to chapter 2 Samuel chapter 9 verse 1. And I just want to add that David and Jonathan were best friends. They had this brother to brother bond, and so that's important to know as we get into this lesson. 2 Samuel chapter 9 verse 1 says, David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness? Watch this part. For Jonathan's sake. That's key to remember. Ladies and gentlemen, typically when a new king comes into power, the new house coming into power would typically would destroy any remnant of the old house that was once in power. So for David to ask, is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness? That was not normal. That was not the typical practice during that time. The practice was that the new dynasty would destroy the old dynasty, so that there would be no living relatives who could claim a right to the throne. It was how the kings would secure their reign. And so for David, not to do just the opposite, look to be a blessing to the old dynasty instead of trying to destroy the old dynasty, was unheard of back in that time. David is doing this because he remembers his promise that he made to Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 14 through 15, and it reads, "But show me unfailing kindness, like the Lord's kindness, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family." There go the promise. "Not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." And the Bible goes on to say in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 16, "So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, May the Lord call David's enemies to account. And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of the love he had for him, because he loved him as himself." Yes. So David, in other words, Jonathan knew that the Lord was with David. And he said, "I know you," I'm paraphrasing, "I know you're going to be king. And when you come into power, don't do typically what the kings do when they come in power. I need you to show love to my family. I need, because me and you got this relationship, and I may die. I'm a soldier. I am Saul's son, but when he goes to battle, I go to battle. So there's no guarantee that I come back. So if something happens to me, I need you to promise me that you'll show love and kindness to my family." And David reaffirmed his oath to Jonathan. Yes. All right, let's move into 2 Samuel chapter 9. We're in verse 2. "Now there was a servant of the household named Ziba, and they called him to appear before David, and the king said to him, Are you Ziba? And he said, Thy servant is he. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to submit to you this morning that David could only learn that there was a descendant of Saul still living, and could only learn where he was through this servant named Ziba. Ziba held a high position among the servants in Saul's house, even after Saul's death. This is why David called Ziba to appear before him. David understood that Ziba had the answers that he needed. David understood that if I want to find out, is there any descendants left of Saul, then I need to get in touch with the guy who was above, who handled all Saul's affairs. He was the high servant. I need to talk to this Ziba guy because he knows what's going on. He knows about Saul's estate. He knows about Saul's next of kin. He was the highest servant in the house. If anybody knows about what's going on with Saul's descendants, it would be Ziba. And so that's why David had him brought before him to question him, to find out some answers. All right, chapter 9, verse 3, when we're in verse 3, the king said, Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba answered the king, There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both his feet. Ladies and gentlemen, David now knows that Jonathan has a son. And David now knows that Jonathan's son is lame in both his feet. And when I read that, what stood out to me is they mentioned the condition of Jonathan's son before they ever mentioned his name. Ain't it funny how the world will describe you based on your condition that they find you in, not necessarily your name. They may not know your name, but they will call you based on the condition that you're in. And I don't know how you feel about it, but when I read this in the text that Jonathan's son was lame in both his feet, I had to ask myself, what in the world happened to Jonathan's son? And the Bible tells us in 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4, that Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both his feet. And he was 5 years old when the news about the death of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled. But as she hurried to leave, watch this, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth, which means out of the mouth of shame. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to point out that Mephibosheth is now lame in both of his feet through no fault of his own. And many of us that are here this morning can identify with a tragedy or a life-changing situation that happened to us through no fault of our own. Many of us can argue the fact that we could have went further in life if someone had not dropped us. Mephibosheth finds himself living with the shame of being lame in both of his feet. 2 Samuel chapter 9 verse 4, we're in the 4th chapter. And the king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel in Lodabar." In other words, Mephibosheth was in hiding down in Lodabar from this new king. Mephibosheth's bloodline made him a threat to David's throne. By all rights, Mephibosheth was next in line to be king. Mephibosheth was the son of the firstborn son of King Saul. And now that Saul and all his sons were dead, Mephibosheth was next in line to sit on the throne of Israel. But instead of being king, Mephibosheth was hiding in a place called Lodabar. Lodabar means no pasture. It is a desert wasteland located east of the Jordan River. We're in verse 5 now, and so King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel. Brothers and sisters, King David called for Mephibosheth to come out of his hiding spot to stand before the king. David was calling Mephibosheth out of his barren wasteland situation into a better situation. But Mephibosheth doesn't know this at the time. David was calling Mephibosheth to come out of obscurity into notoriety. And sometimes that's how God, he will call us out of our barren situation. He will call us out of our hiding places that we've found trying to deal with the pressures that come with being in this world. And oftentimes when God calls us, we're nervous, we're fearful because we don't know the whole story. I see ourselves in Mephibosheth. The king has called him. And so now, can you imagine how Mephibosheth must have felt to hear the knock on the door when the messenger of Saul came and said, "Hey, you got to come before the king." Now Mephibosheth was in hiding because he knew that the new dynasty would wipe out the old bloodline. And so now he's hiding, and so now he's been exposed. David finds out where he is, and he says, "Come stand before me." So Mephibosheth comes, but he has no idea what David wants. He might think David is trying to kill him. We're in verse 6. Chapter 9, verse 6. When Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. Mephibosheth immediately honored David by bowing down in his presence. And then David asked him, "Are you Mephibosheth?" Mephibosheth responded by saying, "Behold, thy servant." Mephibosheth wants to reassure David that he is not a threat to his throne. He said, I'm your servant. I came with humble posture. You called me, I came, I bowed down. Well, I'm at your service, King. He brought the right reverence to David. He came with the right attitude to David. He wants David to understand, hey, I'm not your enemy. Whatever you need me to do, David, I'm at your service. Chapter 9, verse 7. And David said to him, "Fear not, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake. I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat bread at my table continuously." Ladies and gentlemen, Mephibosheth is receiving grace because of the promise David made to Jonathan to show love to Jonathan's family. And I see God in that as it relates to us. You and I are receiving grace because of the promise God made to Jesus.
All right.
David is allowing Mephibosheth to sit at the king's table and to eat like he is a part of the royal family. To be able to sit at the king's table was an honor. It was also a place of influence. Why? Because being at the king's table means you had the ear of the king, which was a powerful thing to have access to. Verse 9, the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belongs to Saul and his family." By David returning Saul's property to Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, David was demonstrating extreme kindness, while at the same time implementing justice according to Leviticus chapter 25, verse 25, that says, "If your brother becomes impoverished and sells some of his land, his next of kin may come and redeem what his brother has sold." Let's move on to verse 10. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. Mephibosheth's grandson of your master will always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. That's a large staff right there. Not only did David give Mephibosheth all the houses and the land that belonged to Saul, but David also gave Mephibosheth all of the servants to do all of the work. With all that David had blessed Mephibosheth with, it made Mephibosheth a very wealthy man. And it also gave Mephibosheth a new identity. Because for a Jew to have land, to own land in the promised land was to say they was in the house of God. To that land was given only to the Jews, and so for him to own land, he's got his identity back. Now remember, he was living in somebody else's house in hiding, and so now David has restored him, have put him in a position of respect. Verse 11, then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like he was one of the king's sons. David is making things clear to Ziba that you and all that you have are to serve Mephibosheth the same way that you would serve me as the king. David is keeping his promise to Jonathan by taking care of Mephibosheth like he was one of his own sons. You know, when God restores us, he restores us completely.
Right.
You know, Mephibosheth was able to get back everything that belonged to his father. He wasn't restored partially. He was restored completely. Verse 12, and Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all that dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. Jonathan's son Micah would carry on the family name, and the kindness of God has been shown through David. And in concluding, I just want to say that David, in my opinion, now this is just my conclusion. David represents God in this story. And Jonathan represents Jesus in this story. And Mephibosheth represents us. And back in those times, if you had something wrong with you, like you were like the woman with the issue of blood, or the blind Bartimaeus, or if you had some physical disability, the thinking back then was that someone sinned. Remember the blind man and the disciples and Jesus walking, and they said, okay, Jesus, this man is blind. Who sinned, him or his parents? And Jesus said, neither one. He was blind for the glory of God. So that was the thinking back then, that if something was wrong with you, the gods were not pleased. And so remember Job, he had all these issues, and his friend said, well, you must have did something wrong. You must have sinned. So Job said, I ain't did nothing. And so Mephibosheth represents us, and all of us got something wrong with us. It's called sin.
All right.
And so David represents God, and so David shows Mephibosheth, who's lame or sin, shows him unusual kindness, shows him grace based on his relationship with Jonathan. Jesus is a better Jonathan. God shows us love based on his relationship to Jesus. He's keeping his promise to Jesus, just like David kept his promise to Jonathan. And so now you and I, with our sin-sick self, are able to come and sit at the king's table as if we've been restored completely. David makes no distinction between Absalom and Mephibosheth. He's restored completely. He sits at the table, and he has the influence. He's in a seat of honor. He has the king's ears. And this is a story of grace. How God restores us based on what Jesus has died to give us. With that being said, that concludes our Sunday school lesson. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to the hands of the superintendent. And thank you.
Give thanks to God for his this on? Yeah. I thank Jesus for God for Jesus for his dying on the cross, and to the superintendent, to the teacher, to all of you that are here. Good morning. He asked about Saul and David. Okay. Saul was not born to be a king. Okay. David was born to be a king. David was God's chosen king before his birth. Saul was not God's chosen king. Saul was the people's chosen king. Okay, at his birth. And so when you look at Saul, David and Saul both were tall men. And back in those days, you had to stand above the crowd. You couldn't be no little fella. You know what I mean? No little stature. you have to be a person that stand taller than the crowd, than the people that are around you. Saul was a tall man, somewhere around close to 7 foot tall or better. Okay, so he could look out over people. He was muscular. He was built. He was strong. He was military, and so that Minister Smith explained it pretty well, you know. And a lot of it I don't have to go over it, but I just want to hit those highlights. Why those individuals are considered as being considered as leaders. So when you are born, sent by God to do a thing, okay, all the favors and blessings are in your favor. Now that doesn't say that you're not going to have some bumps and bruises, and ups and downs, and hide in some caves and things like this, like David had to do. So it's not going to say you're going to have smooth ground. But it also says that you're going to be successful with God being your guide and being your protector. Here you go. Being your guide and being your protector. That's the difference between the two men. So David wasn't pushing to be no king. Saul was pushing to be a king. Okay, so that's the difference between chosen by God and chosen by the people. And chosen by the people is the people. Usually you're gonna do what the people say do. You're gonna go. The people are gonna usually go along with you, and you're gonna do the thing that they want you to do. If it sounds good, Saul said, "Okay, we'll do it." And God told him when they go into this area, kill everything. Don't bring nothing back. Okay, destroy everything. And so Saul went over and killed up a bunch of folks, and he brought the king back, and he brought a bunch, and the people said, "There's no sense in us getting rid of all these fat lambs, and all these fat cows, and all these nice livestock. There's no sense in us destroying all that." And God said, "I said destroy it." And the people said, "We want some of it," so they brought it back. Okay, now when I want to get a little bit further into a little further part into the lesson, not dealing with what Reverend Smith dealt with, but I do want to say this, and I don't want to cover something that has already been covered, okay, because it's just a repeat. But justice and kindness. What is justice? Sometimes you get the two mixed up. What is justice?
What should happen?
Justice is what you say?
What should happen when there's a wrong, the justice is making it right. What should happen?
Right. Whenever something that is wrong, you make it right, as close to right as possible within the law or within the guidelines of righteousness. Now we have to also remember there are two types of righteousness. One is the righteousness of man and the righteousness of God. And so we use the basis of the righteousness of man, we'll find ourselves saying, "Well, the law said this, and the law said this is right," you know, and like what's going on now. If you got 12 men and 6 men and 6 women, or 5 men and 5 men and 7 women on a jury, and the jury said, "Okay, we find you guilty." Blah, 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 and the evidence, and we know for sure that a lot of the evidence does not point towards guilty. But the jury come back and says, "Okay, they're guilty." So for as America concerned, like the president said the other day, "Well, this is what the law said. This is what when they found that boy innocent that was in Wisconsin, who shot them 2 men and killed them, and shot the other one. Well, they said he was innocent. Okay, but the question is, was he innocent? Okay, the next thing is, why did he leave Illinois, go over into Wisconsin to protect so-called property? When you look at righteousness, okay, and justice, and was justice done? I say no, justice was not done. I say injustice was done. Okay. Now he's turning around and making money on something he done did deliberately. killing folks, you know. And so we live in a changing world. We live in a world where there's an atmosphere of injustice throughout our system. Okay, and I said a few Sundays ago, that young man that was killed down in Georgia, I said, if any of those people are convicted, you can consider a miracle has taken place in the South and in America. And they found him guilty. Now, all the evidence was there. He never took anything, just walked. And so they said, well, he must have been the fellow that did the stealing a few weeks ago. You see, and so when we talk about justice and kindness, now, you're not going to get much kindness from the judicial system. And God expect the people in the church to show kindness and show love, because that's why God always sends blessings through peoples, not miracles. Only blessings through people, because people can demonstrate God's love better than any living creature on earth. And that's why God always still has faith in us, even though we're not saved. He still has faith in us that we're going to do some right things, and that we're going to eventually come to, if we're not doing it right, we're going to eventually come to whole righteousness. Okay, and so now David, if you notice, David said, "Is there any family member of Saul?" Now, there was a lot of family members still there. In fact, Saul still had 7 sons left there yet. So when you go over in the 21st chapter of this 21st chapter of 2 Chronicles, you'll find that God told Saul, when you go into the land to destroy the land, the Gideonites, don't bother them, because they haven't did anything to you. And so Saul went in there and he killed a lot of the Gideonites. And when you read the 21st chapter of Second Chronicles, you find what the children of Israel had a famine in the land for three years. Okay, 3 long years. And Saul David couldn't figure out what's going on. Well, David said, I done did everything that God told me to do. And why come myself and the country not being prosperous? Why is a famine taking place? And God said to David, you go to the leader of the Gideonites and ask them what the problem is and what needs to be done, because that's where the problem lies. And the Gideonites, the king of the Gideonites said, give us 7 sons of Saul, that we may hang them, and your problem will be over. God said your problem will be over. And so David gave these 7 sons to this king, and they hung them on a hill, and their troubles was over. The land began to prosper. The famine was over. And so now, when Reverend Smith mentioned about, he was looking for somebody, there was a lot of folks he could help, but he wanted to help somebody that had made a contribution, not somebody who had been a destroyer. Are y'all with me? Not somebody that had been a destroyer. Saul's son was just like Saul. They were ready to fight, and so they had to run, because they knew that David was going to take care of them. But he ended up taking care of them anyway. But David, before he did that, David saying that I want to help somebody in Saul's family. There got to be somebody in Saul's family worthy of being helped. And it's kind of unfortunate, but it's unfortunate the young man got hurt, but it's fortunate that after all those years, that somebody saw in him something that was worthwhile. Okay? And so y'all read that the 21st chapter of Psalm, write it down. 21st chapter of 2 Samuel when you get back home. And see what it said. Now, but one of the other things also that is important here is how they went down through the chain to make this come about. And sometimes some folks are so jealous. Well, I'm not going to get anything, so I ain't going to tell them nothing. You know, and people are that way. If they're not being blessed, they don't want to see anybody else blessed, and they're going to make it possible for somebody else to be blessed. But when you have been blessed throughout your life, you don't mind somebody else being blessed. And one of the things that we as Christians, if it comes to the point where it seems like that we can be a blessing to somebody, even if it's not us doing the blessing, but helping them get blessed through somebody else. As Christians, we have that responsibility to seek that for them. And if we come across something where people can be blessed, we're supposed to let them know, brother, sister, so-and-so, there's a blessing or whatever waiting for you. All you got to do is go there and get it. For an example, say we're giving out turkey to the first 100 persons. I'm just using for an example. You see, some of us won't say anything. We go down there and get us a turkey, and we're going back home, you know. But if we can tell somebody else that they can get a turkey, you know, we need to make sure that what we do to help benefit somebody else is to help them to get along in life. This is what it's all about. The problem that we have is we're afraid that one's going to help the other too much, or somebody's going to get more than me. You know, are they going to be blessed and I don't be blessed? When we look at that kind of an attitude, we have problem being blessed. Because the Bible says the more you give, what?
The more you receive.
The more you receive. And so I'm convinced about that. Because I know that when the more I give folks, the more I receive from God through people. Any other questions before I sit down?